Hi, I'm Hugh Gallagher with Smartmatic.
And I'm Mike Summers, the Program Manager for Internet Voting for Smartmatic. And this is our first Facebook Live post. So thanks very much for taking the time to listen and to join us today. We're going to ask some questions and answer some questions here at the IFIS event in Washington, D.C. This is a big event that many people from all around the world who have a vested interest in elections come and observe this event. So thanks for joining us.
Well, Mike, I found this morning's session with regard to the numbers of people who are going to turn out in the U.S. election to be unbelievable. The number of people who are registered already, the number of people who've already voted. And a key success factor that was pointed out was the explosion of online voter registration. The ability for people to conveniently re-register, register anew, be able to understand where they're going with regards to their polling locations. How do you see that kind of playing out in the areas of expertise that you have with regard to online voting?
Good question, Hugh. I mean, I think that, online voter registration is it's one of a number of online and digital tools which are playing more and more of a kind of prevalent role in what we do in elections. So I think, when you look at online voter registration, as you say, the number of states that allow voters to register online now, I think that's increasing. But also, I think if you look at how the actual candidates and the politicians are actually communicating and how they are getting support using platforms like Facebook, for example, and Twitter and all these other social media platforms, I think that technology and online platforms have an increasingly important role to play. And one of the delegates that spoke this morning talked about that how Facebook and Twitter are becoming the kind of, the meet and greet diner type of events where the politicians used to go and meet people,
right.
And now all of that's taking place online. And I honestly don't think that is going to change, or in terms of we're never going to go back to the situation where the candidates are spending time FaceTime with people. It's going to be online interaction, so that's only going to increase. And I guess that I'm quite positive about that, because I think that the next logical step, if you're communicating and you're campaigning online, is to allow voters who ultimately spend a lot of their time online to actually vote online.
And you've already had that experience, you and I together, this past presidential primary season in Utah, where the Utah Republican Party conducted their presidential preference caucus online. Mm-hmm. And that turned out to be a great success, and we tremendous accolades to the Republican Party of Utah for being very progressive in their thinking, because it was a very inclusive participation by a lot of different type of people. In particular, what I found, and I think you mentioned this to me before, is that out of the numbers of people that voted in Utah online, we had somewhere in the neighborhood of about 50 or plus or so that were over 90 years old, and 2 or 3 people that actually were octogenarians. And the idea being that they were not going to be able to participate. I mean, they just simply didn't have transportation to the caucus locations.
Yeah, exactly.
They were homebound.
Yeah.
And yet, with the technology that was provided out there, they were able to participate in the democratic process. I think a lot of people look at the internet voting equation and say, well, it's convenience. Well, I would also argue it allows for access by people who would otherwise not be able to participate. Traditionally, people are looking at the overseas military and civilian voters, but we have an ever-increasing voting population that's getting older. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, I'm not planning to have my hips replaced anytime soon, but it's a very distinct possibility that I'll get to a point where I'm going to have to rely on very innovative technologies like the platforms we provide at Smartmatic to be able to for me to participate.
Yeah. Well, I think you make 2 really important points. You make the point about sort of the mobility of the electorate, and the fact that we maybe don't want to go to a particular location, to cast your ballot. Of course, there will always be polling stations, and I think that, while we're talking about online voting, one of the other great things that Smartmatic does is provide innovative technology to help create the integrity of the voting in the polling station environment. But I think that we are much more mobile. We live in a global village now. We all travel. We all travel because either we're on holiday or we work overseas or we're in business. And why should we be disenfranchised by not being able to vote? I think that's unfair, and technology, online voting, can help address that issue. And the other point you make about the octogenarian voters that were voting online in Utah is a really great point. And I think that we've reached the situation where technology is accessible and it's understood by citizens of various different ages. And I think Utah showed that out. If you look at the online voting experience in Estonia, which of course is still the only country in the world that does governmental online voting in nationwide elections, the overwhelmingly largest group that use that online voting platform is the 55 pluses. So it's not just a technology that is used by young people. It works for people across the board. So I think absolutely, when you consider mobility and you consider the fact that everybody now is IT literate, I just see more and more people wanting to engage online and to vote online.
It was interesting today that one of the questions with regard to the concern about voter suppression here in the States during the election was centered around consolidation of polling locations, not enough machines, things of that nature. And of course, during the election season, those become very visible things to a lot of people. But as soon as the election is over, people go back to saying, I would prefer to have my streets paved. I would prefer to have that pothole filled. Prefer to have the new school built. And so it's that constant struggle between localities that have a finite budget and ability to gain additional resources. Internet voting at some form or fashion, and I agree with you totally, will never replace in-person voting or the other methods that are used currently. It's a supplement.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a supplement.
Yeah.
It's just an additional channel, but it's an additional channel that could potentially offer cost savings in the terms of not necessarily money per se, but the publicity, the ill will that's put out against localities because they have consolidated their locations. It's much easier to support one polling location than 10.
Yeah.
And you don't need as many machines. But internet voting then still allows you the ability to extend out to those demographic groups that are otherwise going to have some challenges.
Absolutely, and I think that one of the kind of proof points from Estonia is that as internet voting has grown since 2005, when initially it was used by, I think, 2.5% of the voting population, to the point that it is today where it's used by about 33% of the population. One of the things that's enabled them to do is to actually consolidate and get rid of some of the polling stations because they simply don't need as many.
Right.
And if there are less polling stations required, there's less resource required to man them. There's less money spent on the polling station. So I think it is one of those tools which will be used going forward. And I agree. I think what is always important is to make sure that voters are catered for and that voters have a choice. So I think taking polling stations away, that should never happen.
Never happen.
That should always exist. Polling stations should always be part and parcel of.
We want that communal get-together.
Absolutely. Some people, that's really important. But to those people that can't get to the polling stations or don't want to get to the polling stations, there should be a way that is secure, that is transparent, that is accessible. And I don't think the current provisions for remote voting, which are things like postal voting, really fulfill those requirements. Postal voting, and I talk specifically as a UK postal voter because we don't have online voting in the UK, but 25% of the population in the UK vote by post. But postal voting gives me absolutely no security. The only measure, or only method rather, of protecting my ballot is a piece of paper.
Sure.
The method for authenticating using postal voting is I put my date of birth and my handwritten signature. Well, that's not secure. And once that postal vote goes into the postal box, I don't know what happens to it. There's no traceability. So when you look at all the things that we have within TIVI, which is our secure, verifiable online voting platform, we solve all of those issues. We solve all of those things. So I think there's an important message to get out there, and that is one that technology, it's not just about making things accessible, it's about producing solutions which actually improve the integrity of the election process. And I think a lot of people still look at pen and paper and think, well, that's the traditional method, so that's got to be the right way, without really understanding the shortcomings that exist without technology in the process.
Any discussion about internet voting has to ultimately lead to, and before we wrap it up, security. Mm-hmm. That's the issue everyone
Absolutely.
brings up primarily.
Absolutely. Yeah.
How do you, and not that it can't be done in a reliable fashion, but how do you convince politicians and the public that it is secure enough? Mm-hmm. Because if you make anything too secure, it becomes unusable.
Yeah.
We talk about expensive, you're ending up with redundant systems and things of that nature. How do you bring people into the understanding that the system is secure?
Mm-hmm. Well, in truth, it's an educational process you need to take people through, and I think that the problem is there's lots of misinformation about the security of internet voting solutions, and when you see things like the hack on the DMC system, when you see things like the UK TalkTalk system, when that was hacked, when there was a service outage on the UK government digital service, all of those things really kind of fuel the fire in terms of questioning whether internet voting is a good thing or not. But in all of those instances, the problem wasn't necessarily that the systems weren't protected, or that the systems were hacked. In all of those instances, the protections that could have protected those systems weren't in place. Right. And one of the things that's important to stress for something like internet voting, and I think that it's our duty to educate people on this, is that the standard provisions for securing an internet-facing application are not sufficient for an internet voting platform. So, for example, you don't simply rely on architecture and having a firewall and load balancing and using a secure communication between the client and the server. You need to do some additional things. So you need to do things like apply what we call application level cryptographic processes to actually encrypt the vote from the point of casting, to digitally sign that vote, and then use obviously a secure connection to the server, but also to allow voters to verify that those security protections that you have in place are actually working. Okay, so it's two things. It's applying additional security layers, but also providing verifiability, which allows stakeholders to actually check that the things that we say are in place that are protecting the privacy of the vote and the integrity of the vote are really operating correctly. And I think it's our duty to start educating people about the difference between, an internet voting application and an e-banking system or an e-commerce system, because we have those special protections which really are required specifically for things like internet voting.
Well, I'm looking forward to the day where when I'm an octogenarian with replaced hips, most likely, and other body parts.
We won't go into that.
We won't go into to have to be able to still maintain my participation in the American process.
Well,
as long as I'm paying taxes, I have a dog in the game. So
yeah. Well, who knows? Maybe by 2020, maybe even a little bit earlier than you think, Hugh. At least some of the states could be taking those kind of first steps to online voting.
All right, Michael.
Cool.
Thank you. Appreciate it. All right.
And guys, those of you online, thanks so much for joining our Facebook Live, the first broadcast, Facebook Live. So, hope you enjoyed it, guys, and thanks again.